Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm your instructor, Professor Wary, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Eddie Glaude, who is the Chair of African American Studies here at Princeton, and he's also the author of a new book that we're going to talk about today, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Thanks so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Great. So one of the explanations you offer through your reading of Baldwin is that the value gap shapes violence against Black and Brown people. And so let's talk about that. What is the value gap and how does it work with police violence?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for the conversation. The value gap is this belief that white people matter more than others. And that belief shapes our dispositions. It informs our practices, our social arrangements, our political and economic realities. And so the way in which the society is organized, it reflects that valuation. And it's going to look differently in the context of different material conditions. So that valuation will look a certain way in the context of slavery. It will look a certain way in the context of Jim Crow. It would even look a certain way in the context of the first African-American president, right? And so part of that has to do with valuing Black bodies, understanding their relationship to the body politic and the like. And it shapes the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. And it certainly informs perception. So if we're socialized in a society, or let me put it differently, the way I put it in Democracy in Black, is that we're habituated to see the world in particular sorts of ways. And if that involves inherent criminality of particular bodies, the threat that these bodies represent, or even seeing children, for example, Tamir Rice, instead of as a child, but as a 20 plus year old, or to see young girls in school, Black girls in school, as imminent threat, it can, of course, determine and dictate how those particular bodies are policed in certain ways.
And part of this value gap, you write, it depends on the lies that our society institutions have distributed. So it's not a set of individualized lies. They are lies spread by institutions, institutional rules that affirm those lies, and malpractices that are condoned by the court. And so you take quite a bit of time talking about these lies. And so could you talk about a few of them that you go through in the book?
So sure. So in some ways, the lies constitute the kind of the architecture that enables the value gap to be sustained. Excuse me, to be sustained in some ways, and I get this in part from Baldwin. He wrote an essay entitled "The White Problem" in 1964, and there's a wonderful passage where he says the country was founded on a fatal flaw. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, because the country was supposedly founded by Christians and in the name of liberty and equality and the like, there had to be some account for the role the chattel were playing in the lives of these folk. And so they denied that they were men and women. Because if they were not men and women, Baldwin suggested, then no crime had been committed. And he said, that lie is the source of our present trouble. That's a direct quote. So the justification for the institution of slavery involved a set of assumptions about the capacities, the moral standing of Black people. And the lies we told in order to justify treating Black people as ends, as means to someone else's ends, right? Exploiting their labor for surplus value and the like, treating Black women's wombs as sites of capital accumulation, right? A whole range of lies had to be told about them, their capacities, in order to justify a practice, while in some ways professing one's commitment to Christianity. And Baldwin also says in The Fire Next Time, that, you know, America refuses to recognize what it has done. So it tells a host of lies in order to protect its innocence. So one set of lies would be that Black people are lazy. We don't save,
Yes.
as if the wealth gap is a direct result of our individual failures, as opposed to a dual housing market or a dual labor market that impacted our ability to actually save, right? Um, and so there are a host of assumptions about our failures that are attributed to the lie about our capacity, when in fact those failures are bound up with policy decisions rooted in the value gap.
And because the lies are institutionally supported, when there's evidence that demonstrate that the lie is a lie, people are really resistant to it because it
Yes.
came from a legitimate place. The lie did.
So
Yeah.
one of the things about how the lie works, and I talked about this, right? So it's not only the lie that we tell about Black people, it's also the lie that we tell about what we've done to Black people. It's a lie that we tell when reality threatens to reveal the lies that we told. So when the reality then intrudes and shows or demonstrates that a whole host of assumptions about Black people are in fact not true, we then tell a whole host of lies in order to reinforce what we've done up to that moment.
I'm thinking about a lie that I think is on the minds of many, given the debates around free speech. And so, one of the things that Baldwin experiences is that he's seeing it's 1967 Stokely Carmichael getting off a plane, being arrested because Stokely spoke freely. He was arrested for his anti-war and anti-empire speeches, and there were calls to kill him for treason. And so you have this sense of free speech, and he wasn't the only one, right? So there are a number of Black and brown scholars and activists being threatened for their exercise of free speech, and yet we see that notion that free speech needs to be protected gets held up for some, but not others. And so when we're thinking about this notion about our freedoms, our freedom to speak, our freedom to create, how does that sort of impact Baldwin in the time that he's writing?
Oh, right. So, I mean, so Baldwin is constantly keeping track of our hypocrisy,
Mhm.
of the nation's failures and failings. I mean, at the heart of Baldwin's work is what I call a revolutionary inversion,
Mhm.
right? He flips it, right? It's like, I don't focus much in the book on the Fire Next Time, but the Fire Next Time enacts it in this really powerful way. And, it begins in some ways with the epigraph of Kipling's White Man's Burden. And Baldwin flips it. What do I mean by that? He wants to insist that the problem isn't us.
Mhm.
That if we understand that the creation of the inward, right, isn't a reflection of who Black people are, but actually a reflection of the need of some people who hold on to an idea of whiteness. And so he says, I'm not the inward. I've never been the inward. The question is, why did you need the inward in the first place? So he says, I'll give you your word back to you. Who is the inward baby? Right? That question that he wants to put back to. So I think Baldwin is constantly trying to lay bare the workings of the lie, because it keeps us from confronting what we have done. And because we cannot confront honestly what we have done, we can't be otherwise. So he's constantly demanding a kind of mirror,
Yeah.
right? On the one hand, and on the other, insisting that those of us who have to bear the brunt of the lie understand that it's not us,
Mhm.
that we not let it take root in our spirits and distort our souls and disfigure our sense of ourselves. And that all of that is daunting. It's a daunting task to keep track of. But as I say all the time, we all of us may not be able to be poets, but we can all bear witness.
Yes. And regrettably, as he bore witness, he not only had to face a value gap, but he also started finding that his value was being discounted. So there was a sense that he was no longer an artist in these moments in which he started to referred to Black Power in his speeches. And so when we think about Black worth, and we think about this problem of trying to break out of the categories that keep us from freedom, as Baldwin discussed, how difficult is that to do when, in fact, in the moment that you step out of your place, you're sanctioned?
Yeah, there's this wonderful line. I think it's in Black Power, the essay he wrote about Stokely, or what that was motivated by Stokely. Is that he said the moment in which Black people step outside of the orbit of white people's expectations, we're talking revolution.
Hmm.
Right. So I think this is really important, and one doesn't have to kind of think about that formulation solely in terms of race. There's a sense in which Emerson is grappling with this, right, in terms of the distorting work of conformity, right? What conformity does to us. Right? But I think, Baldwin and Black Power is really fascinating. He recognized that these were the same young people who risked their lives in the bowels of the South. So there's this lie that we tell, Doc, that the civil rights movement and Black Power are these wholly separate moments, as if that the people in one aren't in the other. Most people don't read Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture as one of the best nonviolent organizers in SNCC.
Mm-hmm.
He said he never broke nonviolent discipline but once, and that's when the police attacked King. And so what Baldwin is trying to grapple with is these young students, many of whom he had met at Howard and in the South, these young students' eyes darkened because they experienced the terror of the country and the country's betrayal. Mm-hmm. And he promised them in 1963 that he would never betray them. And so when they cried out Black Power, he understood why. He might have disagreed with features of the politics, but he said, how could the country dare not see these children as their own? How could the country dare deny this anger as a product of our own doing? And so the kind of ongoing work of having to decry Black Power for Baldwin was part of this illusion, this myth making. It was a lie in some ways. Now he knew the cost. Mm-hmm. He knew the cost, and he turned his back anyway. Turned his back on the New York liberals who supported him. Never won a Nobel Prize for literature. He understood, and then there was the kind of standard story. It's no longer the case in the academy now, but post 1963, as James Campbell argued, Baldwin's voice broke. He became too polemical, kind of succumbed to the propaganda of Black Power. His rage and bitterness, his fame took over and the like, and the work suffered. When in fact, I think this is much more a reflection of a refusal to deal with the question that Baldwin refused to let go, a refusal to deal with the indictment. Yes. And the conviction that Baldwin refused to be silent about, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It especially makes sense when we think about your discussion of his piece, "The White Problem," and as I'm reading the book, and you write in the book, he saw America as a place that denied the contradiction between its commitments to freedom and democracy and its practice of slavery and white supremacy. And what I often hear from people is, in order to make a fresh start, you should just let it go. And what you're hearing from Baldwin is you can't make a fresh start unless you're willing to bear witness to slavery and white supremacy. And so when you hear this argument about sort of the best way to make a fresh start, why do you side with Baldwin?
Well, I mean, it's so funny. I'll answer that question in two ways, right? Right. One could answer it personally. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to be the best father I could be, yeah. I just can't leave behind the troublesome childhood that I had. I have to go back and deal with the fear that my father deposited in my gut. Otherwise, that deep cellar will move me about.
Mhm.
I will be making choices driven by those experiences because I've never confronted them. So part of what Baldwin calls for when he says do one's first works over is that in order to release yourself into a different way of being, you're going to have to grapple with the choices made, the experiences had that in some ways guide your hands and direct your sight, you know? So that's at a personal level. At a structural level, oh, just leave it behind as if, our zoning laws haven't produced particular outcomes. As if um, redlining hasn't generated something. As if, I mean, I could just go down the line in terms of generations of policy that have produced disadvantage and advantage. And you just want us to start. It's like in Monopoly. You've been going past go 10 and 12 times, and I've been stuck in jail, and suddenly you want to start the game, let me play, but you still have 10 rounds of $200 of pass and go, and you just want to start over. And I mean, you just want to start. You don't want to start over. You just want to, let's forget what's been happening and just move forward. It leaves in place a kind of structural inequality that is unjust and, to my mind, evil, to put it in moral language and ethical language, if that makes sense. That's why I side with Jimmy on this question, right?
Okay. Yes.
Because it's a way, because on one level it's one could put it this way: America often feels like Never Never Land, full of lost boys and lost girls. And the reason why I say that is because what's distinctive about Never Never Land is nobody wants to be responsible. No one wants to be held accountable. And so that language is really about, don't hold me to an account of the world that I benefit from.
Yes.
Right? And that just makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I find with students, whenever I can show them that people doing the exact same things, if you start from where we are now, even if you did more than your white counterpart, you still wouldn't be able to catch up. It's structural, and when they see the numbers and they see sort of the way that we kind of parse it all out, they say, some of them say, "Are you sure?" Even seeing the numbers. And I think the other thing they find surprising is that even people who are experiencing this structural racism and inequality, sometimes they don't see the disadvantages they're up against. When they're then sort of given surveys about, how are you treated at work, they say, "Oh, everything's fine here." But then we look at, who gets promoted sooner, what the pay scales look like, even for the same doing the same work. We do see this value gap. So this is how powerful the lie is.
Exactly.
It's incredible. And so this takes us to the end of your book, because we're doing a sort of a fast run, in which you call for the passing of H.R. 40 to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations, and in short, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in which reconciliation comes about through deliberations over and actions toward repair. So how might this lead to what Baldwin called a new Jerusalem?
Well, it goes back to what we've been talking about. And, Barbara Lee has just introduced, Congresswoman Barbara Lee introduced legislation of something similar as H.R. 40. But it goes back to what we've been talking about. What does it mean to tell the truth? Right? Every nation has its myths. And the kinds of stories we tell and what we choose to leave out actually reveal the limits of our conceptions of justice. So it seems to me that if we tell a better story, this is what the 1619 Project aimed to do, right? We can quibble about the particulars, but what happens to the story of America if we begin with Jamestown as opposed to Plymouth Rock, right? What happens is that Native Americans come into view, Indentured servants come into view. Slavery comes into view, although it's not plantation cotton slavery, right? It's different, right? But the idea of America as a corporation before it's a nation comes into view, right? So what happens when we begin there? Edward Said, the great literary critic, used to say that the problem of beginnings is the beginning of the problem, where we start. And, Brian Stevenson says that truth and reconciliation is sequential. Right? In order for there to be reconciliation, you got to tell the truth. Period. And we have to tell the truth about what we have done. Right? Tell the truth not only of slavery, but its afterlife. Tell the truth not only of Jim Crow, but what did it mean? Tell the truth of Anglo-Saxonism. And this is not to just beat ourselves to engage in self-flagellation. It's actually to orient us to a more just world. Right? It disrupts this perfect union stuff. Right? I keep telling my students, George Washington lied. He didn't just chop down a cherry tree. I mean, I understand the myth, but those false teeth, they didn't come from nowhere. They came out of the mouths of his slaves. What are you going to do with that fact? And so I think part of what I've been trying to do is to say we need to tell ourselves a better story. But it's easy for us to say, well, that involves taking down Confederate statues or Woodrow Wilson's name and the like. And then I said, but what if it's the case that the highways of Chicago are monuments to an ideology? What if I tell you that the built environment of our cities actually reflect the value gap? Right? So when we begin to tell this different story, it sets the stage for a radical reimagining of who we are and how we live together, how we be together. Yeah, I just want to put it that way.
Yes, but there is a different way to be.
Exactly.
A better way to be.
Exactly.
But it has to come from a place of honesty. So here again, so history suddenly becomes important. But it also it has to come alive. So it can't simply be a set of myths that make us feel better about our origin stories, which is what it often is. But instead of a starting point for learning how to move forward.
Yeah, Baldwin has this line that I'll never forget. He wrote it as he resigned from this publication called The Liberator. And it's this line that he said, he wants us to do something unprecedented, and that is create a self without the need for enemies. What are the conditions that allow for that kind of self-imagining? Baldwin, this queer Black man, is queering American politics, queering Black politics, right? Trying to open up space for us to see ourselves, see each other, and see the world differently. And the precondition for it all is this kind of radical honesty with oneself. No wonder I barely survived writing the book.
Well, I think that's a great way to end, with a self without the need for an enemy. And that's the way to begin again.
Indeed.
So thank you.
Thank you, Doc. I appreciate you.